France, August 1944. Dawn breaks over a smoking airfield near Dreux. The ground trembles as a flight of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts roars down the runway, engines thundering like artillery. The air smells of cordite, hot oil, and burnt grass. In the distance, black puffs of German flak hang over the horizon. The pilots know what's waiting for them. Focke-Wulfs, Messerschmitts, and a sky that kills the slow. In one of those jugs, P-47D Missouri Mutt, Lieutenant Sam Whitaker checks his gauges. His altimeter climbs through 12,000 feet, then 15,000. The air thins. The big radial engine should be losing power, should be choking on its own heat. But it isn't. The manifold pressure stays high. The turbocharger whines like a saw. The big fighter keeps climbing. Whitaker grins. "She's breathing," he says into the radio, disbelief in his voice. "She's really breathing up here." Behind him on the ground, his crew chief, Staff Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Hayes, leans on a tool crate and listens to the climb report through a headset patched into the field radio. Around him, other mechanics stare at the telemetry panel, expecting the boost gauge to spike and the engine to blow. It doesn't. Instead, the P-47 reaches 28,000 feet, 10% higher and faster than any Thunderbolt in the group has ever climbed before. The German radar network spots the lone American fighter breaking through contrails above the formation. Two Fw-190s peel off to intercept. They accelerate upward and stall out. The Thunderbolt keeps going, curling into the sun, climbing like a machine half its weight. From below, the Luftwaffe pilots can't believe it. "Impossible," one shouts over the radio. "The American pig can't climb like that." But it can. Minutes later, Whitaker returns to base, engine sputtering, but intact. When the jug rolls to a stop, Hayes runs to meet him. The pilot pops the canopy, still shaking from adrenaline. "What the hell did you do to her?" Hayes wipes his hands on a rag, grins and says, "Nothing the manual would approve of." In his pocket is a scrap of copper wire stripped from a broken field radio. A single jumper line, one illegal modification to the turbo supercharger's control circuit, had changed everything. It started as an act of frustration. For weeks, Hayes had watched his pilots fight in planes that couldn't climb fast enough to survive. Headquarters told him it was physics. He told them it was wiring. And now, the proof screamed from the sky. The P-47 that wasn't supposed to climb had just outclimbed Germany's best. No one knew it yet, but that tiny loop of copper, one man's crazy idea, had just rewritten the rules of air combat. Because sometimes all it takes to change a war isn't a new weapon, just one mechanic who refuses to follow the book. Before Hayes's wire trick, the P-47 Thunderbolt carried a reputation, and not a flattering one. The Luftwaffe called it der Ziegelstein mit Flügeln, the brick with wings. Even U.S. pilots joked that it was more tank than fighter. At nearly 8 tons fully loaded, it weighed almost twice as much as a Spitfire and 3 times that of a Japanese Zero. The P-47 could take damage, yes, but climbing to meet the enemy at altitude? That was another story. It wasn't just pilot frustration, it was math. At 25,000 feet, the thin air starved the turbo-supercharged radial engine. The R-2800's massive 18 cylinders could gulp air like a furnace, but at altitude, its vanes, the ducts, regulators, and wiring, choked its breath. Pilots said the throttle response lagged by full seconds. Every heartbeat of delay meant another German lining up a shot. Above 28,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's performance curve dropped like a stone. The official manuals insisted there was no solution in the field. The engine's boost controller, wired directly to a precision governor, was factory sealed to prevent tampering. The Army's logic was simple. Untrained hands could blow an engine or kill a pilot. But field conditions weren't laboratories. Pilots were dying because engineers 3,000 miles away didn't want a wrench turned the wrong way. Every day, Hayes saw pilots come back cursing. They'd dive into a dogfight only to find their throttles sluggish, their turbo asleep. "I could have had him," one pilot said, slamming his helmet on the wing, "if the damn engine had just breathed." To most mechanics, that was that. Orders were orders. Regulations kept planes flying and kept mechanics out of court-martials. But Hayes wasn't most mechanics. He'd spent his life making dead engines breathe again. Back on his father's Kansas farm, he fixed tractors with no parts, just baling wire and a feel for pressure lines. "Engines talk if you listen," he always said, "and this one's gasping." He spent nights staring at the Thunderbolts' blueprints by flashlight, tracing every wire in the turbo control circuit. It wasn't the compressor. It wasn't the fuel mix. It was something else. A resistance, a restriction, something electrical that told the engine to stop working before it actually had to. Every circuit has a ceiling, but every ceiling has a door. And Hayes, grease on his sleeves and copper wire in his teeth, was about to kick that door open. The world thought the Thunderbolt couldn't climb. The Germans mocked its bulk. The engineers said physics. But in a war where rules killed as many men as bullets, one field mechanic was about to prove that the laws of physics could be bent, with just the right wire. Robert "Bobby" Hayes wasn't born in a hangar. He was born in a barn. Kansas, 1920. The Dust Bowl years. His family owned a small farm outside Dodge City, where engines were rare and money rarer. If something broke, you didn't order a part. You built one. Hayes grew up fixing tractors with fence wire, sealing radiators with flour paste, and starting engines by hand crank. His first lesson came from his father, a quiet man who never wasted words. When Bobby asked why they never waited for parts, his father said, "Because waiting don't plow a field." That sentence stuck. It was his first and only engineering degree. By the time he was 18, Hayes could rebuild a diesel pump from scraps and tell a machine's health by its vibration. He'd say, "A motor's like a mule. It don't lie. You just got to listen." When the war came, he enlisted not to fight, but to fix. The Army Air Forces sent him through basic training, then dropped him in a hangar at Hunter Field, Georgia, surrounded by machines bigger than barns, Curtiss P-40s, twin-engine Marauders, and the new Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. He wasn't impressed by their size. He was impressed by how stupidly they were built. One day during training, he watched a new recruit spend 2 hours trying to start a cold P-47 engine by the book. Prime, crank, feather, repeat, until the battery died. Hayes took over, pulled a line off the manifold, warmed it with a lighter, and started it in 20 seconds. The instructor screamed, "That's not in the manual." Hayes shot back, "Neither was this morning's frost." Word spread fast. If it breathes, Hayes can make it run. In North Africa, he proved it again. A shot-up P-40 landed missing half its oil line. Hayes patched it with chewing gum and a piece of fuel hose, then sent it back into the sky. The brass called him reckless. The pilots called him a miracle worker. By 1944, he was stationed in France with the 366th Fighter Group, tending to Thunderbolts that had seen more flak than daylight. Every day, new damage rolled in. Shredded radiators, melted pistons, burst turbos. Hayes didn't complain. He just rolled up his sleeves. He wasn't supposed to think, just follow procedure. But to him, manuals were suggestions, not orders. Machines don't read regulations, he liked to say. They read hands. And now, staring at a pile of busted turbo regulators stacked like tombstones outside his tent, he saw a pattern. They weren't failing from combat. They were failing from suffocation. Somewhere inside those wires and valves, the engine was begging to climb. And that's when the idea hit him. Part memory, part madness, part pure instinct from those long Kansas nights spent with dying tractors. A little less resistance, a little more air. One wire in the right place. It wouldn't be regulation, it wouldn't be legal, but it might just work. Every machine has a limit. But in war, limits become excuses. And the P-47 Thunderbolt's biggest excuse was its climb rate. On paper, the numbers told the story. The Republic's engineering manuals boasted a top ceiling of 43,000 feet, but that was fiction, a factory fantasy printed in ink. In the field, fully armed Thunderbolts struggled to reach 30,000 feet before stalling into sluggish gasps. The Wright R-2800 double wasp engine was a masterpiece of brute force. 18 cylinders, 2,800 cubic inches of displacement, 2,000 horsepower of thunder. But that power only existed on the ground. As altitude climbed, air density plummeted. At 20,000 feet, oxygen was 60% lower than sea level. And every breath the engine took had to be force-fed by a turbo supercharger spinning faster than a rifle bullet. At 30,000 feet, that turbo needed to spool at over 22,000 RPM. But it didn't, because of one small piece of engineering caution. The boost governor resistor inside the turbo's control circuit limited voltage to the wastegate actuator. That resistor prevented overboost, a condition that could blow the engine apart. The problem? It also kept the P-47 from breathing freely. Numbers don't lie. Rated manifold pressure, 52 nhg at takeoff. Actual manifold pressure above 25,000 feet, 42 in home. Power loss, roughly 400 horsepower. Climb time to 30,000 feet, 7 minutes, 15 seconds. Meanwhile, Germany's Fw-190d climbed the same distance in 5 minutes flat. That 135-second gap was a death sentence. Air combat wasn't fought in minutes, it was fought in seconds. In that time, a Messerschmitt could roll, dive, and climb again while the Thunderbolt was still lumbering upward, gasping for oxygen. Every pilot in the 366th Fighter Group knew it. They'd slam their throttles forward, feel the turbo lag, and curse as the gauges shuddered between too much and not enough. A second too long, and the turbo shut down. A second too fast, and the manifold backfired like a shotgun. Hayes had watched it happen too many times. The data told him what the brass refused to admit. The P-47 wasn't losing to German engineering. It was losing to its own safety limits. He started writing numbers on a scrap of ration box. Volts, ohms, resistance curves. The boost controller drew 24 volts, but only 18 reached the actuator. The lost 6 volts were strangling the engine. He thought about those Kansas tractors again. About how loosening one spring or shaving one gasket could give a dying motor its breath back. The math told him he was right. The governor resistor was bleeding life out of the turbo. And behind every statistic, 400 horsepower lost, 135 seconds wasted, were the faces of pilots who never came home. One wire could change that. Hayes didn't care if it voided the warranty, broke the rules, or got him thrown into a military tribunal. Because in his mind, every number the engineers printed in that manual was already written in blood. And he was tired of doing the math of loss. The fix began at midnight. A crescent moon hung over the 366th Fighter Group's airstrip in France, glinting off puddles of oil and broken propellers. The air smelled of gasoline and mud. Inside a dimly lit maintenance tent, Sergeant Bobby Hayes sat cross-legged beneath a Thunderbolt's open cowling, staring at the maze of wires that fed the R-2800's turbo supercharger. He had a stolen flashlight between his teeth and a length of copper wire in his hand, a salvaged radio cable stripped from a wrecked Jeep. He'd spent the day memorizing the wiring diagram of the turbo controller. Power input, governor resistor, wastegate actuator. Somewhere between those three, Republic Aviation had buried a limiter, a safety that turned a monster into a mule. He found it. A ceramic resistor the size of a thumb. The little block that told the turbo, "Stop before you break." Hayes grinned. Not tonight. He scraped the insulation off his wire and looped it between the input and output terminals, bypassing the resistor completely. A crude jumper, an electrical middle finger to every engineer in New York. It wasn't a big change. But electrically, it was rebellion. Technically, it was sabotage. If the voltage surged too high, the turbo could overspeed, the wastegate could jam, and the entire engine could explode. But Hayes had run the numbers. With altitude correction, it would hold. The risk wasn't blowing up. The risk was getting caught. He replaced the cowling, wiped his hands, and called for his pilot. Lieutenant Sam Whitaker, a 24-year-old with the calm of a poker player, approached with a cigarette in his mouth and a smirk. "You sure about this, Chief?" Hayes spat oil on the ground. "Nope. You?" "Hell no," Whitaker replied, lighting his cigarette from the exhaust manifold's heat. "Let's find out." The next morning at 0700, Missouri Mutt rolled down the dirt strip. The roar was familiar, but the tone wasn't. It was deeper, throatier. The engine didn't cough or lag when Whitaker throttled up. It screamed. He pulled back, and the plane shot upward. At 10,000 feet, the manifold pressure held steady at 52 nhg. At 20,000, it was still 50. At 25,000, the turbo began to howl. But it didn't fall off. Whitaker's voice came through the radio. 30,000 feet in 6 minutes, Chief. 6! On the ground, Hayes clenched his fists, his heart hammering. At 32,000 feet, Whitaker leveled off and opened the throttle wide. The airframe shuddered. The boost gauge pegged at 54 nhg, 12% higher than the manual's red line. But the engine held. The Thunderbolt wasn't choking anymore. It was roaring. Then came the test. 2 Fw-190s on patrol picked him up and dove to intercept. Instead of diving away, the standard P-47 move, Whitaker pulled up. Hayes listened to the radio static, every second an eternity. Whitaker's voice broke through, strained but jubilant. "They can't follow me, Chief. They're stalling out. She's out-climbing them." Minutes later, he was back over the field, engine still intact, heart still racing. When he taxied in, smoke rising from the cowl, Hayes was waiting. "You're insane," Whitaker said, climbing down. Hayes grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. "No, just tired of physics telling me what she can't do." That night he slept beside the plane, the wire jumper still hidden beneath the cowling. One wire, 2 lives saved, a whole sky rewritten. The morning after the test flight, the hangar at Dreux turned into an impromptu laboratory. Hayes stood beside the Thunderbolt's engine cowling while his commanding officer, Captain Moran, pointed at the data sheet in disbelief. 6 minutes to 30,000 feet, that's Spitfire territory. Hayes just shrugged. "Guess you got a second wind, sir." But the truth was more elegant and more dangerous. The fix had nothing to do with magic. It was all about resistance. By bypassing that ceramic resistor, Hayes had allowed an extra 6 volts to reach the wastegate actuator, the small servo that controlled exhaust flow into the turbocharger. Normally, that resistor throttled the system's response, making the turbo spool gently. Engineers wanted safety. Hayes wanted speed. In the R2800, that small change created a domino effect. Voltage increase, plus 6V. Wastegate closure delay, 0.3 seconds. Turbo RPM increase plus 7%. Boost pressure gain, plus 12%. That 12% translated to roughly 140 extra horsepower at 30,000 feet, enough to cut climb time by almost a full minute. It also meant the P-47 could now sustain full boost at altitudes where most Luftwaffe fighters began to gasp. The math was stunning. For years, Allied engineers had chased altitude performance through heavier turbos, refined propellers, and leaner fuel mixtures. Hayes had found a better answer in a single wire, the kind of fix only someone who didn't follow protocol could see. Of course, the modification wasn't without risk. Overboosting the turbo created massive strain on the turbine bearings. A single jammed wastegate could trigger a runaway spool, a mechanical grenade waiting to happen. But Hayes had done something clever without realizing it. The slightly corroded copper wire he used created just enough resistance to keep the current from fully maxing out. It was mechanical luck disguised as genius, Or maybe the other way around. Later testing at the 366th group showed the new climb curve. Standard P-47D, 2,700 feet/min. Hayes modified P-47, 3,200 feet min. Fw-190d, benchmark, 3,000 feet min. For the first time, the Jug could match or beat German fighters vertically. When engineers later examined the modification, they were furious. This could have cooked every turbo in the ETO, one report read. But another, unsigned memo buried deeper in the file said something else. Field-tested improvement appears stable. Explore controlled adoption. And that's exactly what happened. Weeks later, a quiet update appeared in the 366th maintenance log under Power Plant Circuit Adjustment, Governor Response Correction. No mention of Hayes. No credit. Just a small change to the voltage tolerance range. Exactly what his wire had done. He didn't care about recognition. All he cared about was the next sortie taking off on time, and the next pilot coming home. He looked at the blackened scrap of wire still on his bench, twisted from the heat of a night's work, and smiled. "Guess you taught me something too," he muttered. Sometimes the smallest line drawn against the rules can redraw the entire sky. September 3rd, 1944. The morning sky over Dreux shimmered with contrails. Streaks of war drawn across a pale blue canvas. The Luftwaffe was desperate, launching interception sorties from dwindling bases. For the 366th Fighter Group, the orders were simple: sweep, strafe, and survive. Lieutenant Sam Whitaker led the flight that day in his Hayes-modified Thunderbolt, the copper wire still buried under the cowling. His call sign crackled over the radio: Bulldog 1 Airborne. Behind him, 2 more Jugs followed, engines growling like thunderheads. At 18,000 feet, radar picked up movement. Fast. 2 contacts closing from the northeast, climbing hard. Then 2 more. Fw-190s, sleek and deadly, rising to pounce. The standard P-47 tactic was to dive and use its weight to escape. But Whitaker didn't dive. He pushed throttle and prop pitch forward. "Let's see if the crazy wire's still got some juice," he muttered. The manifold gauge climbed to 54 in Haji. The turbo screamed, and for a heartbeat, the plane shuddered like it might explode, then steadied. The airspeed dropped as the climb rate soared. The altimeter spun, 22,000, 25,000, 28,000 feet. Below him, the Fw-190s were still climbing, but slower now, noses wobbling as their engines strained against thinning air. "Bulldog 2, they're stalling," one of his wingmen shouted. Whitaker leveled off and rolled inverted, cutting power just enough to let gravity do its work. The Jug tipped into a hammerhead stall turn, a maneuver the P-47 was never supposed to pull off. He dropped behind the lead German fighter like a falling anvil. The 50 calibers thundered. The first Focke-Wulf disintegrated into a cloud of black smoke. The second tried to bank left, but Whitaker's Thunderbolt climbed again, impossibly fast, flipping back into the sun and ripping another burst into the second 190. Flames erupted from its cowling. "2 down," he called, panting, "and I'm still climbing." The ground crews at Dreux watched through binoculars. To them, the fight looked impossible. The P-47, the flying brick, was performing like a mountain goat in the sky. When Whitaker returned, the squadron gathered around the plane before the prop even stopped spinning. Someone handed him a cigarette. Another whistled. "You made that fat girl dance," one mechanic said. Hayes didn't say a word. He walked around the Jug, hand on the cowling, listening to the cooling engine tick like a heartbeat. Whitaker pointed at him and grinned. "She climbed like a devil, Bobby. Out flew 2 Doras and came home smiling." Hayes exhaled, the smoke curling in the cold morning air. "Told you," he said. "She just needed to breathe." Word spread through the 9th Air Force within days. Pilots whispered about a magic wire fix that made the jug climb like a rocket. Some called it superstition, others demanded it for their planes. Officially, the U.S. Army Air Forces denied it existed. Unofficially, squadron after squadron began checking their electrical systems. And in hangars across France, under flickering lights and nervous laughter, more copper wires began appearing under turbo housings. The line between madness and innovation had blurred, and the air war over Europe would never look the same. 2 weeks later, the miracle wire wasn't a secret anymore. The climb reports, radio chatter, and flight logs all told the same story. Something strange was happening in the 366th Fighter Group. Their Thunderbolts were outpacing German interceptors at altitudes the manuals said were impossible. And headquarters noticed. On September 19th, a black staff car rolled up to the Dreux airfield. Out stepped Major General Orville Brooks, Deputy Inspector for Air Materiel Command, accompanied by 2 men in crisp uniforms and clean boots. Engineers from Republic Aviation. They weren't smiling. Captain Moran met them at the flight line, doing his best to stall. But Brooks didn't waste words. "We've got P-47s pulling climb rates beyond spec. You want to tell me why?" Moran hesitated, then said quietly, "You'll want to talk to Sergeant Hayes." The hangar door creaked open. Hayes stood inside, sleeves rolled, oil-stained, a half-eaten sandwich on the wing of Missouri mutt. He froze when he saw the brass. "Sergeant Hayes," Brooks barked, "did you modify this aircraft's power control system?" Hayes didn't lie. "Yes, sir. Just cleaned the wiring." Brooks glanced at the Republic engineers who were already pulling the cowling off. They found it in seconds. The copper jumper wire twisted tight and soldered by hand. "This," one engineer hissed, "is a court-martial offense. You bypassed a factory governor." Hayes crossed his arms. "Yes, sir, and it worked." Brooks's face reddened. "You understand what could have happened if this burned out? If a pilot overboosted the turbo?" Hayes looked him dead in the eye. "Sir, I've seen what happens when they don't." For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, a P-47 taxied for takeoff, its engine roaring like a living beast. The sound filled the hangar, deep, alive, perfect. Whitaker appeared beside the general. "With respect, sir," he said, "that mod saved my life. Twice. If it's illegal, you might want to ban survival to 2. Brooks exhaled sharply through his nose. "You boys think this is funny?" "No, sir," Whitaker said. "We just think it's effective." The Republic engineers ran tests. They expected the readings to spike, but the engine ran smooth, hotter by a few degrees, but stable. One of them frowned. "Sir, he may have stumbled onto a valid control correction. Turbo lag's nearly gone." Brooks glared at Hayes. "You know what this means, Sergeant? We can't punish you, but we sure as hell can't promote you either." Hayes grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Wouldn't know what to do with the desk anyway." The incident was never written up publicly. The wire mod was quietly renamed Field Electrical Correction Number 8 and rolled into the next maintenance bulletin. The 366th received the first official batch of enhanced climb P-47Ds a month later, factory-made with a new resistor curve identical to Hayes's field fix. Hayes got no medal, no letter, no mention in the logs. But that night, as the pilots toasted another mission flown, Whitaker raised his tin cup and said, "To Bobby Hayes, the man who told a 10-ton plane it could fly like a bird." Everyone laughed. Hayes just shook his head, embarrassed. But when he looked out over the flight line and saw a row of Thunderbolts gleaming under the moonlight, he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. Each one carried a trace of his defiance, a heartbeat of copper and courage buried deep inside its metal veins. By the end of 1944, the crazy wire fix was no longer a rumor. It was standard practice. The engineers at Republic Aviation never publicly admitted where it came from, but the modification appeared in every subsequent production run. The technical term was sanitized, Boost governor tolerance expansion, configuration E. But among the pilots, it had another name, Hayes's hot wire. Across the skies of Europe, Thunderbolts that once lagged behind now rose like rockets. The German pilots who had once mocked the fat jug found themselves stunned when it began outclimbing their Doris and late-model Messerschmitts. The power curve that had once betrayed the American fighter now bent upward, a line of defiance written in data. The difference was tangible. Climb time to interception altitude reduced by 15%. Combat survival rate for the 366th up 11% in a single month. For a mechanic's illegal experiment, those numbers were worth more than medals. But Hayes never saw any of them. He just kept fixing planes. When asked by a young crew chief how he'd come up with the idea, he shrugged. Same way I fix tractors. You listen to what it's not saying. Somewhere between the equations and the regulations, he'd found something no lab could measure. Intuition. The kind of understanding that comes from dirt, oil, and failure. The kind that can't be taught, only felt. Historians later called it field-born genius. But Hayes hated words like that. To him it was simple. The plane needed air, and he gave it air. The legacy, though, couldn't be ignored. By early 1945, the enhanced climb P-47s became the preferred escort for B-17 formations over Germany. When Me-262 jets tried to intercept, the jugs could now reach altitude fast enough to cover their bombers, turning near disasters into triumphs. Pilots called it the rise of the jug. Engineers called it field adaptation. The truth? It was one man's refusal to let a machine suffocate because a book said it should. When victory came, Hayes didn't celebrate. He just watched the planes he'd kept alive roar over a liberated France, their engines screaming like thunder over a broken continent. A war won by numbers had been saved, at least in part, by a single line of copper wire and a mechanic who refused to believe in limits. No medals, no reports, no headlines. Just a quiet victory, the kind that echoes not in speeches, but in engines that still run when they shouldn't. Years later, one Republic engineer, speaking anonymously, admitted the truth in an interview. "We didn't invent that fix, a field sergeant did, we just made it official." And that's how wars are really won. Not by rules, but by the few who dare to break them in the right direction. Because in the machinery of war, perfection doesn't always come from design. Sometimes it comes from defiance. After the war, Robert "Bobby" Hayes went home to Kansas. The hangars and runways of Europe became wheat fields and open sky again. He traded his wrench for a spade, his grease-stained coveralls for a flannel shirt. But some habits never left. Every tractor he fixed, every engine he tuned, he still ran his hand over the metal like it was alive. He didn't talk much about the war. If people asked, he'd say, "I kept some birds flying, that was all." No mention of court-martials avoided or pilots saved. No word of how his crazy wire helped rewrite the Thunderbolts' legacy. Years later, his son, now a mechanic himself, found a small wooden box in the back of the barn. Inside, a coil of copper wire darkened with age. Folded beside it, a worn photograph. A P-47 parked on a French airfield, Missouri mutt painted on the nose, its pilot and crew grinning like men who'd stolen something back from fate. On the back of the photo, Hayes had written 4 words in pencil. "She climbed. We lived." That was his medal, his history. In the decades that followed, air museums and historians celebrated the P-47 as one of the most rugged and reliable fighters of the war, a machine that could dive, fight, and climb against anything Germany built. Few remembered that some of its best performance came not from the engineers in New York, but from a farm boy who refused to stop listening to his machines. When the last airworthy Thunderbolt took off at an air show in 1987, it carried a faint etching on its cowl plate, a tradition among restorers who knew the old story. 3 small letters stamped in copper, BHW, Bobby Hayes's initials, the mechanic who made the sky just a little bit bigger. That's how innovation really works. Not from orders or equations, but from people willing to risk everything on instinct. Because when rules say no and lives say yes, the only question that matters is, can it fly? And for Bobby Hayes, the answer was always the same. If it breathes, he said, it flies.